Do you know that feeling? The one where you walk through a place that used to be your entire world and suddenly realize you've become invisible in it. The coffee from the machine you once lobbied to install tastes like it came from someone else's kitchen. The low hum from the data center, once a soundtrack of innovation, now sounds like a warning bell. For nearly 14 years, this company was my life. My name was on the founding license that launched its $1. $2 billion valuation, the blueprint, the heart, the bedrock. But to the new executives, I was nothing more than an outdated footnote, a line of text on documents they never bothered to read. They were about to learn that some footnotes hold up the entire narrative. My name is Carla Benning, and back in 2009, I helped launch Trivergent Health Tech in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was 44 years old when we filed the paperwork. Now, I'm 58. I was the lead systems designer, the one who transformed a wild idea about real-time diagnostics into a scalable infrastructure used by hospitals around the world. I remember the early mornings, the weekend marathons, the caffeine-fueled whiteboard wars. We believed we were creating something important, something that could outlive us. And for a while, it did. But after we were acquired last year by a West Coast conglomerate, everything changed. The vision turned to margins. The mission turned to shareholder returns. The new CEO, a man named Jackson Price, was everything you'd expect from a corporate takeover. Polished, distant, fluent in metrics not meaning. He replaced department updates with dashboards and replaced collaboration with compliance. I watched as our purpose was repackaged into something that could be pitched to investors. Our health-first culture got lost behind talks of quarterly forecasts and market capture. I used to be central to those conversations. Now I'd see meeting invites marked optional next to my name. Reports I poured weeks into were acknowledged with automatic replies. Thanks for your input. Funding for future tech. The area I had built from scratch was quietly frozen. It was slow and deliberate death by 1,000 corporate cuts. Not one dramatic firing, just a steady retreat of meaning and space until I no longer recognized my role. They wanted me to fade quietly. They didn't realize I had helped build the frame of the house they were now gutting. And they certainly didn't remember the clause I'd buried in our founding license, the one that would come back to haunt them. So if you're listening at work on your break, maybe driving, tell me, where are you tuning in from? Drop your city or state in the comments, because this story isn't just mine. It's ours, and I'm just getting started. The man orchestrating my quiet erasure was Lucas Grant, the new vice president of human resources. Sharp, charismatic, dressed like a GQ model in suits that probably cost more than my first car. But I remembered him differently. 10 years ago, Lucas had walked into my office, clutching a flimsy resume and nerves so thick he almost spilled his coffee during the interview. He was fresh out of grad school, all ambition, no polish. I saw potential raw and sincere. I vouched for him. I mentored him. I believed he understood the mission we were building. Now, Lucas didn't see people as collaborators. He saw them as cost centers, rows in an expense report he was determined to shrink. And he was unraveling the very culture he once claimed to admire. One Tuesday morning, I took the long route back from the break room. The coffee was tepid, bitter, fitting for the mood. I passed through the main hallway past cubicles that once buzzed with collaboration. That's when I saw them. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the executive conference room, once our symbol of openness, I caught a glimpse of CEO Jackson Price and Lucas standing before a massive screen. It displayed an org chart. My eyes locked instantly on a section outlined in harsh red. My division, systems architecture and emerging tech. My entire team. Gone. I paused behind one of those oversized ferns. The new management insisted improved employee wellness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lucas spoke with an ease that made my stomach turn. He gestured at the red block and said something that turned my blood to ice. I couldn't hear him, but I didn't need to. I read his lips. Her entire unit is a financial drain. She's a relic of the original phase. Her name on those old filings, it's symbolic. It doesn't affect the roadmap. A strange calm took over. No panic. just the quiet arrival of undeniable truth. They didn't just see me as obsolete, they saw the very foundation I had laid as irrelevant. The ticking clock I'd been sensing for months, it had a name now? Reckoning. After lunch, the email came. Its subject line read, "Invitation to discuss strategic organizational realignment." Translation. My execution appointment? Lucas's office was on the top floor now. Sleek. Sterile. The skyline view behind him felt like a wall separating me from the company I once helped build. He smiled, a polished, hollow thing. The kind of smile I'd seen him practice in front of department heads he planned to quietly push out. I took a seat. He had no idea what was coming. He motioned for me to sit, and I immediately noticed the chair lower than his, deliberately so. It was the kind of petty power play you pick up on after enough time in boardrooms. I didn't react. Just sat down calmly, setting my half-empty coffee on the edge of his spotless desk. Without pleasantries, Lucas slid a glossy printout across the surface. The same org chart I'd seen through the glass. Neat lines and color-coded boxes that surgically erased the work of a decade. My department was gone. My name, nowhere. "Carla," he began, his tone polished and mechanical. "As you're aware, Trivergent is shifting toward a leaner, more synergistic operating model. Our focus is now on delivering maximum value for shareholders and driving core efficiencies." He paused, likely believing the words had weight. To me, they felt weightless. Empty buzzwords stacked to disguise a hollow decision. As part of that evolution, he continued, "We've made the difficult but necessary decision to dissolve the systems architecture and emerging technologies division." Then came the lean back, the clasped hands, the mask of benevolence. "However," he added, "Jackson and I deeply respect your legacy here. That's why we're offering you a consulting role. Flexible, project-based. You'll have the opportunity to share your insight on an as-needed basis. A role without authority, a paycheck without pride, a muzzle wrapped in a handshake." I let the silence hang, staring not at him, but at the corner of the org chart where my name had once stood. I gave him the one thing he wasn't prepared for: nothing. No plea, no outrage, no grateful nod, just clarity. Finally, I met his eyes. Eyes I once saw filled with hope and potential, now dulled by cold ambition. "No, thank you, Lucas," I said evenly. "That won't be necessary." His mask cracked, just for a second. A twitch in his jaw, a quick blink of disbelief. The plan had derailed. He recovered quickly, adjusting his tie and his smile, but now it was clipped dismissive. "As you wish," he replied curtly. "Your building access will be disabled by 5 p.m. Someone from security will escort you out." He expected bargaining. He expected panic. He expected me to beg for relevance. I didn't. I stood, straightened my jacket, and walked to the door without a word. Each step on the polished marble floor echoed with something heavier than resignation. It was finality. And it wasn't mine, it was theirs. And if this story spoke to something, and you stick around, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this isn't the end. It's the beginning of something stronger, and I'd be honored to have you with me for the next chapter. They just didn't know it yet. Colleagues I had known for over a decade kept their heads down, suddenly engrossed in emails or staring at their shoes. The energy in the hallway shifted as I passed. I was no longer a leader or peer. I was an uncomfortable reminder of how fragile loyalty could be. At the main entrance, Derek, the longtime security guard who always greeted me with a cheerful "Morning, Miss Benning," avoided eye contact as he escorted me out. He held the door open, hands clenched around his clipboard. I stepped into the crisp Minneapolis air. Just like that, 14 years of my life closed behind me with a soft, magnetic lock. But Lucas, brilliant strategist that he fancied himself, had overlooked one crucial detail. He and Jackson Price had stripped my badge, access, disconnected my email, and killed the lights in my old office. But they hadn't touched the only credential that truly mattered. Because my access had never been stored on their servers. It sat quietly in a fireproof safe beneath my bookshelf at home. It wasn't a login code or digital credential. It was a clause, a promise, etched in ink and legally binding. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't mournful. I felt something steadier than anger, something more potent than grief. Clarity. My home office felt like another lifetime, warm and personal, every object earned. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with research binders. Old prototypes from the company's earliest phases sat under soft lighting. A framed photo of our original 6-person team smiled at me from the corner corkboard. I didn't stop to reminisce. Not today. I moved with deliberate calm, opening the closet and crouching before the safe I hadn't touched in years. The dial turned beneath my fingers with the familiar rhythm of an old habit. The door opened with a low click. Inside was a heavy leather-bound portfolio, edges worn but intact. Across the front, in gold, Trivergent Health Tech, founding documents. I flipped through pages of incorporation paperwork, early-stage agreements, stock allocations, until I found it, tucked near the back just as I remembered. The clause I had written with my late husband, a man who had insisted that creators should never be disposable. Section 4B, the cornerstone clause. It was never meant to be used lightly. It wasn't about revenge. It was protection crafted for the exact situation I now faced. The language was clear. Any founding signatory terminated without cause and without mutual agreement could trigger a buyout. The price non-negotiable, predefined. 20 times the net profit of the last fiscal year. A formula that once protected a fledgling startup, now threatened to collapse a billion-dollar empire. And they had just activated it. When we first drafted it, the clause was a safety net meant to protect founders from being pushed aside once the money started flowing. Back then, it was a fair sum for a modest operation. But now, with Trivergent valued at $1.2 billion, the math was devastating. The payout would shatter their balance sheet. It would push the company to the brink of insolvency. I exhaled slowly, a breath that felt like it had been waiting years to be released. This wasn't a technicality. It wasn't some dusty relic buried in legal jargon. It was a door, one I had built into the very bones of the company, a key I never imagined needing. Until they handed me the lock. They hadn't just terminated me, they'd done it with dismissive arrogance. They erased my department, offered me a powerless consulting role, and assumed I'd fade away. But that exact combination, termination, without cause, without mutual consent, triggered the clause in full. It was airtight. I closed the portfolio slowly. The thud it made on the desk was soft, but it sounded like justice. Reaching for my phone, I scrolled through familiar names until I found one I hadn't called in years. Tom Ellison, my attorney from the early startup days. He was more than legal counsel. He had helped draft every foundational document and understood what we built better than anyone. He answered on the second ring. "Carla?" He said, his voice tight with concern. "I just heard what happened." "Don't be sorry," I replied calmly. "I need to ask, do you remember the cornerstone clause we put in the original IP agreement?" There was a long pause. I could almost hear him flipping through mental files. Then came a soft, drawn-out whistle. "My God," he said quietly. "They didn't." "I believe they did," I said, looking out at the low winter sun dipping behind the skyline. "They just made $1 billion mistake." Tom's response was firm and immediate. No emails, no phone calls, no emotion. "We do this by the book." We spent the next day crafting the letter, sharp, precise, emotionless. A legal scalpel. We cited Section 4B, laid out the terms of their breach, and stated that I was invoking my right to a full buyout of my intellectual property stake. They had 30 days to comply. After that, their use of my technology would become a legal liability. The next morning, I drove to the downtown Minneapolis post office. I didn't just drop the envelopes in a bin. I stood in line, sent each of the 10 certified letters, with return receipts, one to the CEO and one to each board member's private residence. There would be no denials, no excuses, no escape. There would be no plausible deniability. The postal clerk stamped each envelope with a solid, deliberate thud. 10 certified letters, return receipts attached, sealed, and sent. It didn't feel like sending paperwork. It felt like starting a clock. like setting a timer on a very quiet, very precise bomb. What followed was silence, strategic and cold. I had anticipated at least one urgent call from their legal team, maybe even a cease and desist letter drafted by one of the overpriced law firms they like to flash around. But there was nothing. It was a move, of course, a deliberate one. Ignore the threat. Pretend it's meaningless. Paint me as a bitter former exec grasping at relevance. To them, silence was dominance. What they failed to grasp was that the clause didn't require their agreement, it only required that they be notified. And they had been. Thoroughly. The 30-day clock was ticking whether they acknowledged it or not. I didn't hover over my phone. I didn't draft long emails or refresh my inbox. I returned to the rhythm of my life. In the mornings, I worked in my garden, clearing out winter debris and prepping the soil. There was something healing in tending to things that grow with time and care, especially when the company I'd nurtured for 14 years was now slowly dying from its own neglect. A week passed. Then the silence broke. The call came from Richard Halverson, one of the original board members. Richard had been part of the founding advisory circle, a numbers man with a conscience. He'd stayed on, but I always suspected he was quietly suffocating under the new regime. His voice, usually composed, cracked with unease. "Carla, what in God's name have you done?" "No pleasantries, Richard," I replied softly. "I simply exercised a contractual right." "There's a letter," he said, lowering his voice. "They're passing it around like it's nothing." Jackson laughed during a staff meeting, called it a bluff. I said nothing. Let him continue. "And Lucas," he said, practically whispering now, "he actually held your letter up in front of 3 department heads, handed it to his assistant and said, 'File this under archived history,' then tossed it aside like junk mail." I let out a quiet breath. "Thank you for telling me." I ended the call and sat in the stillness of my home office. They thought they were being clever, publicly dismissing my legal action like it was a joke. But they had just done something incredibly foolish. They had turned their disregard into evidence. A witness had seen them mock a legal notification. When I told Tom, his tone shifted instantly. Calm turned razor sharp. "They just handed us negligence," he said. "Documented, witnessed, unmistakable, willful negligence." Tom said, his voice cutting clean through the phone line. "That's what this is, Carla. They've crossed from arrogance into active recklessness." He didn't have to explain it, but he did methodically like the old litigator he was. By theatrically disregarding a formal legal notification in front of witnesses, they had forfeited any defense of ignorance or oversight. The clause wasn't just ignored, it was mocked. They knew, he said. They understood the risk and chose to pretend it didn't exist. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "You know, I remember when you and Ethan insisted on that wording. The cornerstone clause. I thought it was overkill back then." He paused. "I've never been so glad to be wrong." But his advice remained steady. "Do nothing," Tom said. "Let them stay overconfident. The 30-day clock is still ticking. Just wait." So I did. The following 2 weeks passed in that strange quiet known only to those who are certain of a storm coming. Outwardly, Trivergent Health Tech carried on as if nothing had happened. The stock price held. Their press releases touted expansion into South America. Analysts on investor calls were fed lines about record-breaking quarters ahead. To the world, I looked like a non-event, just another veteran quietly exiting stage left. But beneath that polished exterior, I knew the cracks were spreading. Each day I returned to my garden with quiet purpose. Deadheading roses, pulling up root rot, making room for new growth. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. I was nurturing life. They were unknowingly cultivating collapse. And then the first tremor came from across the Atlantic. My phone rang late one afternoon. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Richard Halverson. His tone had shifted from concerned to panicked. "It's the German deal," he blurted out. "The Munich distribution contract, it's on indefinite hold." He rushed through the explanation. Their German partners, meticulous, thorough, borderline obsessive, were completing due diligence for an $80 million renewal. As part of their process, they had requested a currently valid, fully executed license for the core technology. A routine check, one-line item on a checklist. But all Trivergent could produce was the original founding agreement, the one bearing my signature. When the German legal team learned I had left, they requested a new addendum confirming the chain of ownership. The company had nothing to give them. No addendum, no legal continuity, just a gaping hole where their credibility should have been. The Germans froze everything. $80 million. Gone. For now. All because they had forgotten the cornerstone and who still held the keys to it. For a company like theirs, a contract isn't just paperwork, it's gospel. And any ambiguity, especially around intellectual property, is treated like contamination. The Germans didn't hesitate. Any question about a foundational license wasn't something to circle back to. It was a flaw so serious it halted the entire $80 million renewal on the spot. Richard told me Jackson Price lost his temper in a senior staff meeting. He reportedly tore into legal for missing the clause, furious that such an ancient piece of paperwork could throw a wrench into their market expansion. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant, ever the spin artist, downplayed it to the executive team, called it a minor documentation gap, assured everyone it would be resolved in days. But this wasn't a glitch they could patch. This wasn't an HR form to reissue. They had started to realize the ghost they thought they'd buried wasn't gone. I was still very much in the system. Only now I was speaking through legal channels. That same morning, as chaos simmered in their glass tower downtown, I received an email. No fanfare, no emotion, just a simple automated notification from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I opened it without hesitation. It was a formal notice. Trivergent's request to amend the core technology patent filed quietly just 3 days earlier had been denied. The reason crystal clear application rejected due to failure to secure signature of all original license holders. My name. They had tried once again to erase it, not from a meeting agenda this time, but from a federal record. And just like before the system I helped build held firm. I didn't feel triumph. No fist pumping, no gloating. What I felt was grim, steady satisfaction. The kind an engineer feels when a pressure valve releases at the exact PSI it was designed for. 15 years ago, I had helped engineer this company right down to the fail-safes they never bothered to learn. And now, every bolt and clause was clicking into place with mathematical precision. I forwarded the USPTO rejection to Tom with a single subject line, "For your records." His reply came quickly. No greeting, no small talk, just what mattered. "They're building our case for us, Carla. Every move shows a pattern of incompetence and bad faith. The arrogance is turning to desperation, and desperate people make bigger mistakes." He was right. I had said nothing in public. I hadn't leaked anything to the press, but my quiet pressure patient, legal strategic, was working better than any press release or outburst ever could. And I knew the next mistake wouldn't take long. The news about the stalled German deal eventually leaked quietly at first. A small column in a respected financial publication hinted at internal instability at Trivergent Health Tech. It didn't mention me by name, but it pointed to ongoing IP complications involving legacy contracts and unresolved licensing terms. To anyone reading between the lines, it was clear something was broken at the foundation. The market reacted. A noticeable dip followed. Analysts began asking tougher questions. The pressure forced Jackson Price to call an emergency all-hands meeting. A recording of it found its way to me, courtesy of a former colleague who still believed in what the company used to stand for. I listened in my kitchen as Jackson stumbled through his speech, his voice brittle-strained beneath the polished language. He blamed outdated contracts and an uncooperative former stakeholder for the disruption. Then he passed the mic to Lucas Grant. Lucas's voice was louder, firmer, but empty. "I want to be perfectly clear," he declared. Our world-class legal team has reviewed this frivolous claim and determined it holds absolutely no merit. The matter is under control. It was a desperate show of strength, and it was falling apart. Just as the recording ended, my phone rang. Tom Ellison. His voice, usually measured, was clipped and urgent. "Carla, they filed suit." I didn't respond at first. "They're suing you for corporate extortion and attempted business interference," he said grimly. "It's bold, reckless." My heart didn't race. I didn't panic. I felt cold clarity. "They just handed us the keys, didn't they?" I said quietly. Tom didn't hesitate. "They did. A lawsuit forces discovery. Now they have to open the books, emails, memos, meeting minutes, everything. They think they've backed me into a corner," I murmured, "but they just invited us into their boardroom. And they made it public. The company issued a press release within hours painting me as a bitter former executive trying to leverage outdated documents for personal gain. It was dramatic, and it backfired, because I wasn't the only one they had dismissed. The phone calls started that evening. First came a voice I hadn't heard in a year. Lena, one of my brightest engineers, laid off last fall during Lucas's restructuring. "Carla, I saw the news." "It's a lie," she said, shaking with anger. "I was in the meeting last year when the acquisition team flagged the founder's license. I still have the emails. Price was on them. By morning, Tom had a secure, anonymous upload portal live. Within hours, documents began pouring in email threads, legal memos, internal risk assessments. Proof that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was calculated negligence. And now, it was traceable. It was never a misunderstanding. It was a calculated risk, and they were losing the bet." Then the next call came. It was Robert Lang, Trivergent's original CEO, the one who had founded the company with me before stepping down a few years ago. His voice was low, but the frustration was unmistakable. "I read their press release," he said. "Carla, they're trying to rewrite our history." I stayed quiet. "That clause wasn't some throwaway detail," he continued. "It was created to protect the people who built this company. I'll provide an affidavit. I'll testify if needed." His support validated everything. He'd stayed silent when the company shifted course, but now, when it mattered, he stood behind me. Later that evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The man introduced himself as a senior journalist from a national business paper. He had been tracking the stalled Munich deal, the dip in Trivergent's stock, and now the lawsuit. "Their story doesn't add up," he said bluntly. "Off the record, I'd like to hear yours." I paused, staring out the window as dusk fell over Minneapolis. For months, I'd fought this battle quietly through contracts and certified letters. But this was a new front, the court of public opinion. It was time the market understood the difference between a name on a payroll and a name on a patent. My interview with the journalist led to a scathing exposé, well-researched, thorough, undeniable. It outlined the timeline, the legal oversight, the silencing of engineers, the mishandling of risk. It reframed the story not as a former executive gone rogue, but as a corporation gambling with its own foundation. The fallout was swift. The stock, already weakened, collapsed. The tremor had become a full-scale collapse. That same week, I received a formal summons from Trivergent's board chairman. An emergency meeting. This time, I wasn't being silenced. I sat at one end of the boardroom table beside Tom. Across from us, a pale, exhausted Jackson Price and a silent, visibly shaken Lucas Grant. The chairman's tone was subdued. "Ms. Benning, hey, we're here to listen." Tom rose and laid out everything: the wrongful termination, the ignored legal notice, the mocked letter, the halted German contract, the USPTO rejection, and lastly, the emails proving Jackson knew the risk and buried it. Silence. Then the board's most powerful investor leaned forward. "Mr. Price," she said coolly, "did you authorize her termination?" Knowing this, he said nothing. He didn't have to. The next morning on day 30, I called Tom. Proceed. At 9:00 a.m., our press release went live. The legal claim was filed. By noon, both Price and Grant were gone. The company halted production. The board offered me everything: cash, a seat, a public apology. I took the settlement. And I built again from the ground up because they forgot my name, but my signature never left the page. If you've ever felt invisible in a room you helped build, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and what part of this story hit home. Because this wasn't just my battle, it was for every quiet builder who got pushed aside. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I stood firm in what I knew I had created. If you're in that season now, know this: you don't have to explode to take back your power. Sometimes the strongest move you'll ever make is the one written in silence, sealed in ink.